English, and thank you for joining us again today. My name is Sarah Shuja, and I'm a marketing manager at McGraw Hill. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we will be covering in the session today. So we will be talking about 21st century skills. We know what those are, so we will be defining those skills, especially for the foundation year programs, and potentially, or interestingly, we'll also be covering a few new ones. And I am very excited to hear what those new ones are going to be. The session will also cover some challenges you experience while introducing them in your learning context, and we will also be exploring some solutions to that. And lastly, we will also be looking at some examples of how these skills are integrated in new interactions. So thank you so much. And we've got moderators for today. Chris, can you change my slide, please? Thank you. So I will be a moderator along with my colleague Hamad Khilji, who is the head of marketing, and we'll be here in the background to support you. If you have any questions at all, or if you face any technical difficulties, please let us know, and we're more than happy to help you out. We'll also just a few FAQs that come in before I hand over this session. So this webinar is being recorded, so you will be receiving the recording of the webinar via email. And the participants who are attending the live session here, so I think we're about 77, 80, going up all the more, better. We will receive a certificate of participation through email. So watch out for that email in your inbox. Should come in soon, and you can download your certificate of participation. And the duration of the session is 60 minutes, and we do encourage that you interact with us through the chat box or the Q&A and make most of the session. I have our speakers with me. I'm so glad to have Christopher Graham join us for this webinar, and his bio will be up on your screen very shortly. And he's an English language teaching expert and has been working in the industry since 1981. I cannot see his bio on the screen. And more interestingly, he's worked on projects and approaches to digital version of the ELT during the COVID-19. I think that's his recent project. Thank you so much, Chris, for being here.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
No, we're very pleased you could do this with us again. And I also have, I'm very pleased to have Rachel Finney join us for the session as well. She's a product implementation and training consultant with McGraw Hill. And actually, Rachel has worked in the English language teaching for almost 30 years. So I'm so glad to hear from her experience here for the session. And thank you so much for your time for being in this webinar. We're so glad you could do this with us. Thank you.
A pleasure, Suresh.
And I think that's all from my side for now. Unless there are any questions for me or Hamad, we're here in the background to support you and help you if you have any questions. And with that note, I will hand over to Chris. Thanks you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon. I think to most of you, it's still morning for me. So good morning from quite sunny London. Let's say quite sunny, but for at least it's not raining anyway. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but looking at my bio and Rachel's bio, between us, we have over 60 years of experience in English language teaching. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So hopefully over those 60 years, which seems like a lifetime, we have, we have a lot of, I think, varied experience. So hopefully, today's an opportunity for us to share one or two of our ideas with you. And another thing, we've got 91 participants now. I don't know from how many countries, but I think from about, I'm guessing at least 10 different countries. I saw a statistic recently from the British Council that says at any one moment in time around the world, there are 1.5 billion people learning English. That's billion with a B, not million. So that's a really interesting figure, isn't it? Just the number of us engaged in this community. I mean, between you today, we're probably several hundred students if we count all your classes up. So we really are a global community, and I'm very glad to have spent my more than 30 years in it, or 60 years if I combine it with Rachel. Okay, here's an outline, an overview of what we're going to do today, which Sheresh already touched on. we're going to try and explore a little bit exactly what the 21st century skills are. Many of you will have seen them on the back of course books that you're using or online, or some of you may be using them, maybe already developing them with your students. And just to say to that, you may be developing 21st century skills with your students without knowing you're doing it. I'm just giving you a little something to think about there. So we're going to explore what the 21st century skills are. We're going to discuss a little bit why they're so important in the academic English context, in the university context, foundation program context. Look at one or two challenges and hopefully some solutions to challenges. And then with Rachel, we're going to have a little Q&A discussion at the end, looking at some examples from the new interactions course materials. I probably, as usual, have too much material for the time, but don't worry, I will make sure that you will get a recording of this, and I'll also ensure that these slides are available as a PDF for you to download through McGraw Hill. I'll arrange that as well. Okay, so here's the first question. What are the 21st century skills? I'll give you 2 minutes to put anything. If you hear 21st century skills, what do you think of? Put anything you think of in the chat box, please. That's the chat, not the Q&A. I'll be watching the chat box. So anything that answers that question. Critical thinking, somebody says, Beulah, thank you. Anybody else? Here we've got communication. They all begin with C. Creative thinking, empathy. Oh, they're coming quickly. Oh, whoa, coming. I'm being attacked by ideas. Soft skills, collaboration, interaction, tech. Somebody says, yep, you've got lots of ideas. A lot of them do begin with C, and we know what it is. Critical thinking, decision making, reality. That's a nice one, isn't it? Negotiating, meaning, flexibility. I've got a very informed audience today, I think. Time management, team playing, leadership, negotiation, lots and lots of ideas. I absolutely agree with all of those. And they're still attacking me, but I've got some really interesting ideas. Or social media communication, someone's put. Absolutely. Artificial intelligence, high flex learning. There's a lot. Well, let's develop on that. These are the traditional ones, aren't they? I suppose. Traditional sounds an odd word to say when you're talking about something for the 21st century. But those of you who've maybe explored a little bit around 21st century skills will know that the initial development of them focused around these four C's, as they're known: collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity. Though they're called 21st century skills, they're certainly not new, are they? They're things that have been around for a very long time. There's nothing new about them. But these are the four that everybody thinks of, and most of you listed some of these words beginning with C. And I think you'll agree that that's a good starting point, a good base point, I think, isn't it, to take as the discussion. And also we have these: information, media, and technology skills. Information skills is about how we react to ideas that we find particularly online. This is where critical thinking and ideas online come together, perhaps. The sources of information, if we start to look at media schools, where the information comes from, how the validity of the information is connected to where it comes from, sometimes at a very basic level, separating fact from what Mr. Trump called false friends, fake news, and also looking at a very simple level on Google, separating an advertisement, a paid for post, from real information. So these kinds of skills. Yes, and technology skills. Now, I think a lot of people think 21st century skills, technology skills are the main skills. They're not. I don't think they are, but they are certainly important as access to online information and media. So we've got the 4 C's. We've got information, media, and technology skills. So we've got a bunch of them there. But maybe we need some new ones. So in the chat box again, some of you have already suggested some new ones, because we had those that we had. Some of you use the 4 C's. Any new 21st century skills you think we might want to put? False news is rampant. Empathy is important. So empathy might be one. That's a nice one. Any more new 21st centuries? Because emotional intelligence, Fortini, that's a nice one, isn't it? Yes. Emotional intelligence, reasoning. Empathy sits there. Empathy is coming up quite a bit. Empathy and emotional intelligence are obviously close neighbors, I think, aren't they? Ethical reasoning. Any more to come up there that we might need? Any more new ones? Oh, that's an interesting one. Entrepreneurship has come up. More and more of us are working as freelancers. We don't have fixed jobs with fixed salaries anymore, so we become entrepreneurial, I think. Cultural, interesting. Coding. Wow, we've got some stuff here, haven't we? There's another one that caught my eye, which I thought was interesting. Flexibility, data analysis skills.
Somebody
Excellent.
mentioned social responsibility, Chris.
Social responsibility, that's what I was looking for, actually. You can read my mind. Social responsibility, absolutely. So we've got a lot of potential new skills. Of course, one of the problems is organizing them, because the good thing about the 4 Cs is it's a nice, neat set of boxes that we're putting the skills into. And I think we need to categorize them, and learners need them to be categorized. But yes, I think what you said are really interesting. Rachel, were you good? Sorry, Rachel. Yes, Rachel. Sorry, yes.
It's quite
Rachel's
all right.
got a quote for you.
Exactly. I just wanted to read this quote because I think it captures where we are at the moment with 21st century skills. And as Chris says, the need to categorize them. It's been very clear cut and convenient so far, but that's kind of blown apart a little bit. And so many of you have mentioned highly, highly relevant soft skills that people need. I was looking at Cambridge Handbook of Employability Skills. And I think that this quote summarizes where we're at the moment as reflected by everybody's comments. So employers now are looking for these soft skills, these social skills. And what's required of students as they go into the world of work now and for them to be employable is the following. The need to work well with other people with different backgrounds and potentially conflicting interests. There is also an increasing need for higher level thinking skills, to be more critical of information and opinions, to be able to make a connection across complex ideas and data sets, and to think creatively to solve problems. There is also a demand for more personal, emotional skills, the ability to maintain motivation despite setbacks, to have a positive attitude when faced with challenges, and to deal constructively with change and uncertainty. And I mean, that's massive, but that's the expectations of employers when they're looking for employability amongst our students as they move on into vocations. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you, Chris.
That's nice, Rachel. Thanks. Maybe we can add that to the slides before we send them out to people. We can put them in so that they can find them. So again, it's this idea of categorization. And what I really liked about that quote that Rachel just shared me was this idea of dealing with uncertainty. All of us have had over the last 2 years have been living in a very uncertain world. I mean, COVID has shown to us that as a species, we do have a great deal of resilience. We can cope, we can find ways, but even just in our own little world of English language teaching, coping with the shift to emergency remote teaching, to having to teach online next week, something many of us had never done before, has shown the importance of dealing with crisis, flexibility, dealing with change is extremely important. These are some of my personal ones that I like. Somebody mentioned culture. I think intercultural communication is becoming more and more important. You know, it's a cliche, we live in a globalized world. So the ability to interact successfully and smoothly with other cultures is very important. I would argue intercultural skills. I think empathy is very important. And I might draw that out towards emotional intelligence. I've also got eco-literacy. I don't have much time to talk about eco-literacy, but eco-literacy is the ability to put sustainability and environmental challenges at the center of our thinking and at the center of our discussions. And those of you who have heard of Daniel Goleman, who's was the academic who came up with emotional intelligence as a term, he teaches at Berkeley in California. He also was part of the team that has developed the concept of eco-literacy. And if you Google that, you will find him. It's an emerging area, but obviously, given the climate situation, is very important. And another interesting one is translanguaging. The idea that your students, many of your students, will in their working lives and indeed in their lives as students doing their undergraduate work, will be operating in two languages. Their home language and English, or maybe two home languages and English. Many cultures translanguage already, where you have two home languages, perhaps a dialect and the standard, and people switch from one to the other. So I think translanguaging is an interesting one, but there are many, many others. Resilience is one I could have added, which would take into account what I said before about adapting to a crisis. So I think it's something we need to think about. I think we also probably need to give 21st century skills another name, because we're 22 years into the 21st century now, but that's another discussion, perhaps. I want to look at why these skills can be so important in the academic context. So I thought I'd take what is a very current topic, and those of you who've seen me speak before will know that I'm quite interested in the environment and talking about the way we relate the English language teaching community with the environmental crisis. So I've chosen a very current topic, the global water crisis. What I mean by the global water crisis is the fact that the biggest impact of climate change on the world is the impact on water supply, in two ways: either, in very simple terms, too much water or not enough water. And wherever you live in the world, there has been that impact. One of the problems with talking about the environment in Northern Europe is people say, well, it doesn't have any effect on us. We don't see the impact of it particularly. And then you say, what about the floods last year? Oh, the floods, yeah, they did a lot of damage. That's why. So too much water or not enough water, but in very simple terms, is one of the major impacts of climate change. The way it affects crops, people's ability to feed themselves, how it affects sanitation and hygiene, and so many other impacts. And this topic might be taught in geography, biology, economics, history, right across disciplines, not only in scientific disciplines. So I've taken that just as an example topic, and how we might think about applying some of these 21st century skills. And I'm going to stick with the C's, the 4 C's, just as it's a clarification. It's a structure that we have. So I here combine critical thinking and collaboration. What is the crisis? What I just told you, basically too much water, not enough water, and the impacts of that. What causes it? Well, you need to know a little bit about the science, probably the fact that the increase, effectively the increase in temperature is what is causing it. And what are the implications? The implications of flooding and the destruction that goes with that. Flooding can often, in developing countries, destroy sanitation and hygiene. It can destroy crops. Or the lack of water means that there is drought and crops fail. People can't feed themselves. Either way, there are problems. So getting students engaging with this topic and using critical thinking and collaboration to actually, in effect, define what the crisis is and what the causes of it are, fits very nicely. Here we've got collaboration and creativity. Getting students working together to agree what the challenges are and to discuss approaches and solutions. You might say, creativity, what's that got to do with it? But creativity is a term that's, I suppose, sometimes misused. Unfortunately, creativity, creativity is somehow associated with music or art. He's very creative, people say, because he's a good artist. Oh, she's very creative. She writes lovely songs. That's fine. Creativity, for me, is essentially using this great tool we have up here to find solutions. And the climate crisis requires creative solutions. So collaboration, working together, combining our brain power to suggest solutions. They may be solutions at a local level, they may be solutions at a national level or an international level, but the two skills interlock together very nicely to find solutions to the problem that we've just defined. And I've also got creativity and collaboration here. Digging down a little bit more. Okay, we have the solutions. What are the challenges with implementing these solutions? What needs to be done now? Who needs to do it? And therefore, what are the next steps? So these WH questions around, okay, we're defining the solutions, but what do we need to be aware of that might go wrong? And what exactly needs to be done now? Who's going to do it? What do we do first? What do we then do? Again, it's very easy to make student activities around these. And communication. Whoops, the N has moved. Sharing ideas and initiatives. You have your ideas, you have your solutions. Sharing them and communicating them is often the biggest challenge. One of the biggest problems about communicating with kind of intermediate, kind of B2 students upwards, you can talk about, they say, what's the problem with communicating the messages around the water crisis? And I'd hope students would say, well, some people think it doesn't affect them. Some people say it's nothing to do with me. I'm not interested in that. That may be one problem with sharing ideas. Others might say, oh, it's too scientific. We can't explain the scientific ideas. Well, how can you go about making the science accessible? Others might say, oh, it's just so bad, we can't do anything about it. Eco-anxiety. Oh, it's terrible. We can't tell people about this. It's too depressing. So there's a lot of things we need to think about when we come to communication, not just English at all, but about the mechanisms. I've got clarity of language and ideas, but choosing the most effective channels according to the age of people you're speaking to, the background of people you're speaking to. So a lot of work can be done around that theme. Whoops, sorry. But equally, we can also, if I can get my slides under control, there we are, look at information and media skills, how the crisis is reported by different organizations. Obviously, some of the charities, some of the NGOs and some government bodies will communicate the messages in one particular way, but you may find other companies and organizations will report the problem, if they report it at all, in a totally different way. What are the differences between the way it's reported and why does it matter? So there we're involving students thinking, well, that's interesting because that organization, why aren't they telling us? I see why, because they are contributing to the crisis. So developing information and media skills, developing critical thinking. My point about the 21st century skills is that they are all interlocked. They all work together. They're not usually used discreetly, one by one. They're used, we jump from one to the other, and I think that's the way to teach them. And I've broken it up here just to suggest a way of exploring a particular crisis. But there's always buts, aren't there? In this section, I want to think about challenges. But before I come to that, I was very interested in the chat. Somebody said, we don't do enough critical thinking about critical thinking. And that's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? We don't always think exactly, we don't think hard about what we're trying to achieve. Critical thinking is what it says. It is looking at something from every different position, from underneath, from behind, from inside. And it can be very hard to get students to push themselves to do that. So what about underneath? How do you think she sees it? That's what how you see it. Do you think she sees it the same way? Maybe not. Why not? Well, okay. So yes, we need to do critical thinking about the way we teach critical thinking and about critical thinking itself. So a few challenges. COVID, our friend COVID, which I hope we said goodbye to, but I don't know whether we have or not, has unfortunately pushed us online. One of the problems with working online, teaching online, as we're working online now, is it's less collaborative and more teacher-centered. Even if you do use breakout rooms and all these other things, and now Zoom has a whiteboard function I spotted today, it is still very much teacher-centered. And a lot of the work that we did in our face-to-face classes to try to give more autonomy to the learners to look at challenges, to look at problems, has gone or been reduced anyway. So I think we need to think about mixing platforms away from Zoom and Teams, which are both very, very teacher-centered, getting students to make Padlets, for example, which they can work on collaboratively, and then you can share, looking at the more intimate discussion platforms, looking at forums. There are other ways to get away from you being very teacher-centered. I think that's a problem that's come from COVID. The digital divide. Now, as I said before, a lot of people say 21st century skills are tech heavy, and to some extent that is true. If we're saying to students, go away and research this, go away and see what other people are saying about this, go away and find 2 stories that report this in a different way, is a fantastic activity. But we need to be sure our students have connectivity. And I think even in fairly wealthy communities around the world, it's surprising that some students, some learners do not have access to tech. They simply can't do it. Either because they don't have it at home or whatever reasons, they don't have the connectivity, or they don't have the devices. So we need to consider that, and we need to always be ready to say, well, actually, I've done some research myself. I printed these out. You could look at these instead if you can't go online. So I think we shouldn't overassume about access to the internet. It's easy enough to do sometimes. But as I say, go away, research this, go away, find 2 different stories that report this differently. What a fantastic activity that is to be able to do with students. This is what I said before. I said you might be already teaching and developing 21st century skills without knowing you're doing it. So my question was, where are the examples of good practice? Because very often in course books, 21st century skills are labeled, they're there. They're important, they're in boxes, they're in the course book, but there are not the examples of good practice. And I think the difficulty around 21st century skills is they can seem very disconnected. We keep telling students how important they are, but they don't actually get to see, oh, someone's doing it. Oh, I see, I see what they're doing. Well, actually, the best example of it is probably you as a teacher. If you are a learner-centered teacher, a teacher who likes to put students into groups to collaborate, to explore some grammatical points, to discuss some issues around the language, or to look at 2 texts and compare the way the text treats something. If you're a teacher that does that, you are, maybe without knowing it, asking students to employ 21st century skills. They're collaborating, they're communicating. If they're doing a problem-solving activity, they might be doing, they might be creative. And even, I would argue, if they're looking at a piece of grammar and thinking, well, that does that, therefore that does that, isn't that critical thinking? Looking at something, thinking, oh, that's okay. Now I've got the rule. It's this, plus that. Got it. So we're probably employing 21st century skills anyway. But I bet you don't tell the students you're doing it. I think there is the opportunity to say, look, guys, just stop for a minute. Now, what were you doing? Oh, we were working in groups. Were you talking to each other? Yeah, we were. What were you doing? Oh, we were trying to find a solution to this problem you asked us to do. Do you remember those 21st century skills? Yeah, kind of. Well, so you were collaborating, you were being creative, you were communicating. There you are, a living, breathing example of 21st century skills in action. And I think if we can actually say to students, you're doing it already, and I'm helping you do it, we're in an excellent position. So think about that. Think about just pausing an activity after, say, a group work and say, okay, let's think about what you just did. Unpick it, if you like, and say, you did this, you discussed that, then you looked at some writing you did, and then you made some notes, or you made a poster, you communicated. Oh, okay, so they get to see how it actually works. So you're an example, really, a living, speaking example of 21st century skills in the classroom. When, at least when you're working face to face, as I said, online, it's a slightly different situation that we're dealing with. This is a concern, assessing 21st century skills, and I think one of the problems around 21st century skills, or I suppose how seriously they're taken, if that's the right, yeah, maybe the right word, how seriously they're taken, is they're very hard to assess. We know more or less how to assess a student's progress in the language. You know, we have our progress tests, we do interviews, we do grammar activities, we do listening comprehensions, reading, all that stuff that we do, which works as well as we want it to, probably. We're not bad at assessing progress in the language. We've been doing it, you know, since the 1920s, probably. We have ways of doing it. 21st century skills is rather more complicated. I mean, assessment, there's no doubt about it, motivates learners. Yeah, they were never going to admit it, but knowing there's a test, an assessment, an assignment, or something, some measurement at the end, oh, we better do this because we're going to be measured on it. It sounds kind of sadistic, but I think it works. It focuses people. I mean, 21st century skills are not assessed, then they're not taken so seriously. And I think we can assess them, but it's not an easy thing to do. So another challenge around this is not only can we not assess them easily, but if we do try to assess them, we mix up language ability with skills ability. And as I say there, you may have a student who speaks, and I say speaks because that's probably the important one, excellent English, who therefore may appear to be very good at communicating, who may appear to be the person who's doing the thinking in the group, who's being creative, simply because their English is better. It may not be the case. It may be the case that there are other learners in the group who are doing that work, but this guy just speaks better. So he appears to be better at 21st century skills, and the opposite's true as well. We've all got these students who are fantastic thinkers, and they're really, they just are not able to articulate it in English. So we somehow need to be able to make that separation between language performance and 21st century skills performance. And it's not easy to do that, because always as language, oh, she's really, really fluent, I'll listen to her. We do that. But that just means her English is better. It doesn't mean anything else at all necessarily, though it might be the case. And another thing that's complicated is that students' character or emotional intelligence, if you want to use Goleman's words, also influence how good they are at 21st century skills. Public performance. A lot of 21st century skills require people to speak publicly, to say, well, we did this, we did a survey of all our colleagues in class, and this is what we found, A, B, C. Somebody has to stand up and do that. Not everybody can do that, regardless of English, regardless of anything, simply because they couldn't do it in their own language. They just find it too difficult to do. So we have to be careful that we're not measuring character, that we're not measuring personality or emotional intelligence, whatever you want to call it. Connected with that is self-confidence. Some people are just more self-confident. They will be in their first language, and they probably will be in English as well, because they just can do it. They can talk. The English may be really disjointed and full of errors, but they can communicate the message. Fantastic, good for them. But we have to remember those that can't, and shyness as well. Some people are just, you know, they don't like speaking in public. And I think all of these characteristics, if you like, for some of the 21st century skills can make assessment more complex, because, well, that's because actually she's really quiet, but look what she's written is fantastic. So all these things we need to be able to bear in mind. And another challenge is learning cultures. Different learning cultures can impact upon 21st century skills delivery. 21st century skills flourish in what I would call questioning cultures, cultures where asking questions is normal, expressing disagreement is normal. Critical thinking is driven by questioning. It's asking questions, or real or rhetorical questions. A culture of autonomous learning, where I'm not going to tell you the answers, go and find them. If you really can't find them, come back to me. But for now, go and find the answers. A very teacher-led culture where there is a lot of what I would call teacher dependency. It's harder for students to develop these skills because, as I talked about autonomy, researching, questioning without the teacher. And many cultures are very teacher-led. Or research-driven cultures where research is the thing, where people go away, find answers, and come back. So depending where you're working, these cultures can interfere is the wrong verb to use, but can influence how easily or otherwise 21st century skills can be engaged with. I mean, 21st century skills are taught in the United States as integrated into school curriculum, and I think it's fair to say the US is quite a questioning culture, and to some extent a research-driven culture. They're very common in the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Again, these are fairly questioning cultures. So the learning culture does have an influence, and we have to bear that in mind. So it's an immensely complex question. It seems to me the way to do assessment is step by step, to somehow, with the learners, not just observing them, but talking to learners, asking them the process they went to get from here to here. Because it seems to me, in a lot of 21st century skills, critical thinking particularly, there is no right answer. Almost by definition, there is no right answer, but there's a right process. I was terrible at maths at school. I mean, really, really bad at, I still am, but I was really bad at maths at school. And I think for those of us who were really bad at maths, the teacher asked us to show our workings. You know, as he wanted us to write down what the process we'd gone through. We always got the answer wrong. Those of us who were in the sort of E group or something, we always got the answer wrong. But he could see why we got it wrong. He could see the processes we went through. He was learning from that. And I think it's in a sense the same process to say to students, okay, that's really interesting. I enjoyed seeing your groups working. Okay, let's choose one group. What did you do? We did this, we did this, we did this, we did that. You can assess that. Why didn't you read that article? Didn't you realize that that was an advertisement? That thing you printed out from Google, that was an advertisement. Somebody paid for that. Oh, so these kinds of things you can start to assess and evaluate. As I say, the solution or the answer doesn't matter so much. What matters is how they get to where they got to. So my advice, if you're trying to assess the process and not the result, but remember all these overlays of learning culture, of student character, and the overlay of English language level too. Just because this woman is so good at speaking English doesn't necessarily mean that her critical thinking skills are more developed. We get confused because we hear the language is better. So a step-by-step assessment of the process. It means you listening, observing, watching groups properly. But it also, very importantly, I think, is asking them to reflect. As I say to them, okay, that's really nice, fantastic. Now, tell me what you did. And it also makes them think, oh, we did this, but wow, we didn't look at that. Ah, I didn't think of that. Why didn't it? I don't know why we didn't. That was really important. Or, who wrote this? Oh, it's the same guy wrote them both. Ah, that's why they're the same. So little things like that when they're exploring text, when they're looking at arguments, asking them to unpick it. So assessment of process rather than result, I think, is important. Okay, now going to move to the final section. We've got 20 minutes or so left, something like that, 15, 20 minutes left, section 4. And in this, look at us, Rachel and I are going to talk a little bit about 21st century skills in new interactions course material. And I've got a question for you, Rachel, which everybody can see now. It says, I'll read it out to you. How about that? Rachel, tell me about 21st century skills and new interactions.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you so much. Okay, obviously I want to talk about 21st century skills in connection with new interactions because it's a course I work so closely with at McGraw Hill. And it's not called an English, a 21st century skills course. It's called English for Academic Purposes. And it has a very strong thread running through the course of academic skills. skills that are designed specifically to help students in that transition from upper high school into a college learning environment where they're likely to be taught through the medium of English with some notion of what they're doing next in terms of their educational career and subsequently their jobs. So that's the academic skills strand. My point really is that everything you've said about how when you go down into the granular level of 21st century skills and the sub skills and so forth are all embedded in academic skills as well. The academic skills set the scene, they kind of provide that foundation from which students can then develop more thoroughly their 21st century skills. They're kind of setting that, putting that keystone down for them, if you like. So, so that's the link for me. That's how actually the academic skills equate with and work towards and embody 21st century skills. I don't know if you want to move on and we could just have a quick look at some of the elements of this in new interactions. So what this is a page from the scope and sequence at the beginning of one of the new interactions books, and this is from a listening and speaking book. Just look at the first thing, for example, organising information. We ask students to do that lots of times in course books. They might be ranking something, putting it in a personal order of preference. Even in smaller primary school courses, they'll maybe go from the biggest animal to the smallest animal, organising information. We do it all the time in our daily lives. My shopping list is a shining example of organised information, despite the fact I generally go to the shops and forget to take the list with me. But we're always doing it, and the students are always going to be doing that when they're in jobs and in their daily lives. So in a small way, we're setting the scene here. We're asking them to think more critically about how they organise information. Why are they doing it? What is the information? What's the purpose of the organising of that information? So it's a simple thing, but it's there, and it's sowing those seeds of a 21st century skill in terms of being analytical, thinking critically, and so forth. Underneath that, you see using a matrix diagram. And again, any visual information is relevant in terms of skills, developing different skills, whether it's a graph or a matrix or a pie chart or simply a photograph. It gives information in a certain way that needs to be interpreted. So again, students are doing that. They're using information presented in different forms. They're interpreting it. They're thinking about it. They're thinking of what that means, and they're kind of extending their ideas. So again, 21st century skills. Because we've got a lot to get through, just if you would move on to the second slide, because that's a slide from the scope and sequence for a reading and writing book, where obviously a lot of the skills in this particular book are based on text, basically. And one of the things you see very often that crops up throughout the book is synthesizing and discussing ideas from a reading text. And that's such a vital skill. It's so important. It's important for the students when they're learning academic skills, because much of their work is going to be based on text-based, whether it's text online or text in a print book, that they will need to think deeply about. They'll need to understand the ideas. They'll need to collaborate with their fellow students to discuss the ideas and move on from there. But it's in our everyday lives, it's in our working lives, particularly if you work in publishing, but it's in tons of people's working lives, that they're presented with a written piece of information, might be a memo, a boss or something, it might be some instruction, and they need to understand that information. They need to think about the reason for it. Why is it being created? Who is it for?
Rachel, you're breaking up quite badly.
So again, things that are
Rachel, we can't hear you very well.
Oh dear, Rachel, can you switch your camera off?
Appear and can be starting life, if you like, as academic skills. So you want to just go to the next slide.
Hamid, shall I take over, do you think?
Well, tell you what, Chris, if I am breaking up,
Phil, can you hear us?
Because I can see such a lot of activity going
Rachel.
on in the chat.
Shosh, do you want to mute her and I'll take over? Yeah.
Questions. Yes. Yeah, just a second. Right. Now.
I'm trying to mute her. Oh,
okay. Yeah, we okay. Rachel seems to have some tech problems. So I'll just carry on very briefly for a few, just 5 minutes more, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. So she was, I don't know where we lost her exactly. We were talking here about the critical thinking. This is from level 4 reading and writing. These are some of the things that I was talking about before. If you look at bottom right, synthesizing and discussing ideas from a reading text, analyzing options on a theme. These are the kind of what I would call deep reading, critical reading activities that I was mentioning before when I was talking about the examples for assessment. Actually, did you do this? How deeply in the text did you go? Well, you missed that, didn't you? What about this here? So getting students to engage fully with text. I've got some actual examples of activity, of activities here. This is from level 2, listening and speaking. Here we have ideas about, this is about study habits, as you can see, asking people to think about the ways that they study, the ways that they worked, ways they work autonomously, whether they take breaks, these kinds of things. So it's done by looking at the study habits of 2 individual people and then comparing with their own habits. So it's a reflective critical thinking activity around study habits, because inevitably developing study skills is very important for students at the foundation level. Here we have a little activity around cultural norms, differences in cultural behaviors, the way cultural behaviors are changing or not changing. So it's critical thinking, but remember I mentioned intercultural skills, intercultural thinking, intercultural communication as being an important possible new 21st century skill. Here's another critical thinking activity about asking why students don't graduate, why some students fail to graduate. And this is interesting because it's a critical thinking activity, but about a topic that is highly relevant to students working in going on to their undergraduate studies. So contextually, it's very suited to the students, but also so it's something that's perhaps in the back of a lot of students' minds, what can go wrong while I'm studying? But equally, it is a good critical thinking activity. Rachel, are you back? You are.
I am, but you carry on because I'm so scared I might just disappear again.
Okay, I'll carry on. You feel free to come in there, yeah. Here we have a researching and presenting activity. This would sit nicely underneath, particularly underneath communication, if we want to stay with the 4 C's, but also media skills, also arguably technology skills, and also arguably critical thinking. Going away, finding ideas, making notes, and then presenting your findings. It's also collaboration. So as I said before, it's all the 4 skills, those 4 skills linked together with others. Dropout rates in different countries, maybe cultural issues, cultural differences. For example, in some countries where students tend to study in their home university, they don't leave home, they tend to take much longer to complete their degrees than they do if they go away from home. There are often economic drivers for that. So there are lots and lots of different ways of looking at these topics, I think. Now we go up quickly to reading and writing at level 4, slightly higher level. Again, critical thinking. This is, what's the theme here, Rachel? Is it about risk taking, yeah?
People saying activities, yes. I think, yeah, I can't actually remember what it was related to. I just was looking at the fact that students were just making the decisions about true or false and having to question what's behind each of these statements rather than just take them face value.
Okay. Nice. And there's also an intercultural thing there, because any of you have explored any intercultural communication, you will know that attitudes to risk and uncertainty is one of the biggest cultural divides around the world. There's a direct connection between risk-taking and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are risk takers. The US is full of risk takers. It's a very entrepreneurial society. So there's also that overlay as well. We've got another one here about city life, urban life, qualities of lives. Again, critical thinking.
It was particularly as well, Chris, the fact that students are looking at the images and which was when I disappeared before, and taking information, hypothesizing, looking at what they can see, thinking about the setting, and then they're answering questions, but they have to make deductions and they have to really think critically about what they're seeing, every bit of information and what it means in the bigger picture and so on.
The power of imagery is very important, yeah. And also I'd say that some students who've moved perhaps from a rural area or small city to a bigger city to study, you know, we all know have cultural changes. It's this is very different from what I'm used to. So again, it's relatable. It's something that the students think, oh, okay, well, I've come to this big city and it's a bit different here for some of the reasons that are being explored here. There's another one here about the role of universities, formal education versus informal education. Again, it's critical thinking, collaborative, discussing, communication, discussing, and it's relatable. It's about higher education. It's about the world that the students are inhabiting, newly inhabiting. If they're on a foundation program, this is all new. And this idea that the way that universities teach is very different from the way that schools teach. And if students are going to drop out, it will often be for that reason. They don't feel as supported at university as they do at school. So it's also, these are important discussions in themselves, plus all the 21st century skills work that we could do around them. Here's a piece of writing work. This is really nice because it's a very effective way of teaching writing in itself, exchanging drafts, commenting, peer reviewing, but it's also collaborative. It's also getting students working together. And for me, you know, I write things, and Rachel's been my editor. A good editor, a good reviewer is someone who says, actually, I don't understand that. Rachel's obviously never said that to me, but I don't understand that, or I don't agree with that, or maybe this should go here. And developing those skills to be a supportive colleague doesn't necessarily come naturally to an 18-year-old to say, well, they tend to say, oh, it's fine, it's really, really good. Oh, I like that, it's fantastic. Saying it's really good is unhelpful. Saying it's really good, but I don't actually understand paragraph 2 is helpful, because then I can look at, oh, I see what you mean, and play with it. So you've got a great writing activity, and also some lovely 21st century skills work around it in terms of collaboration, communication, team working, whatever you want to call it. So that's the end of the part of us speaking. Rachel's now back in the room. I will stop sharing. Now, there's been a lot going on in the chat. Whoa, lots and lots.
Yes, that is true. I actually think that the chat box was very interactive. So I just want to thank all the participants who were interacting amongst themselves. Thank you so much. We're really glad we were able to take ideas from each other, your peers and everything. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them right now. Yes, you will get a copy of the slides.
Let me just scroll through very quickly and see one or two things.
While you're doing that, Chris, can I just say something? We will send a copy of the slides. I had some notes about the slides that my internet decided to crash out of totally, but I can put those together in a slightly neater form, and those can go with the slides as well, just to explain some of the points of deduction that I wanted to make in
lovely, excellent, yeah.
Between new interactions and 21st century skills.
Improvisation, a possible skill. Yeah, it's a nice one, isn't it? It maybe a byproduct of creativity. The voice is cracking, yes. Consecutive checking and reflecting before the final submission and final grading. Nice, absolutely. We can assess students by letting them teach. They can practice language skills, public speaking, building structure. And yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of peer teaching is a winning format for so many reasons. effort and willingness to do it that matters. Yes. I'm just scrolling through quickly. There is talent and personality. Some people prefer staying quiet. Yes, they do, absolutely. And they tend to be judged badly. Especially now, we have a very vocal world, I think, where making noise gets attention. And the quiet thinkers often kind of disappear. Oral versus writing cultures. Yeah, that's a really interesting. Some cultures depend upon the written word and others on the spoken word. I mean, in the UK, it's in writing. I'll still have the habit of saying, if somebody says to me, okay, so I'll meet you, we'll do this, I say, well, could you just send me an email to confirm? So, well, I just told you to send me an email because I don't believe it till it's in writing. And these are cultural challenges that we can come up against. Let me just keep scrolling. Rachel, if you see any you want to...
Right.
Oh, I've just dropped in the email address if anyone wants to get in touch with us.
Thanks. Real critical thinking can take us into uncomfortable arguments. Yes, you're absolutely spot on. You're right. Edward is saying this. Fearful of institutional power, institutional. Yes, absolutely. Critical thinking can be problematic. And we as teachers need to know where we have to stop, depending on where we work, where we live, and all these other things. And I think it's particularly challenging for teachers working in a culture that is not their own, because they don't know where to stop.
Sorry. Yeah. Are there any websites that you suggest us to read more about?
I can send some, yes. I can do that. I'll send you a few ideas and you can send them out.
Sure.
Be glad to. Brainstorming. Anything else, Rachel? Because we're nearly out of time.
Well, I missed the discussion. Let me just scroll. I think the critical thinking thing is that when we're encouraging and supporting students to do critical thinking, to develop that skill, we have to include in that the sensitivities around it. We have to, for everything really, there's a context in which they'll practice those skills. And the wider look at the wider vision of 21st century skills is that people will be empathetic, they'll be aware, they'll be respectful, and they'll have all those interpersonal skills as well, because those are relevant in terms of context.
But it sometimes difficult topics come up, and yeah, as you say, I mean, well, in fact, I mean, having empathy and intercultural communication as 21st century skills can sometimes be a way that we refine, or the way that we filter the kind of questions that we ask. But I mean, you know, the world is changing. I mean, as I say, I've done a lot of work in climate change, and I've always thought that certain countries in the world, climate change was not necessarily a topic that's easily discussed. I mean, I think in many cases I've actually been wrong about that, but we need to be sensitive, but we also need to be willing to ask difficult questions sometimes. Right, we have 1 minute left, so it's time I stop talking, I think. So thank you, everybody.
One question here, Chris. How can we make critical thinking with lower students? And I do believe that we can encourage, if you mean lower level of language ability, or whatever, we can still encourage them to ask those questions about anything they hear or read, why, where, how, who, all those WH questions, and to just think a little bit more deeply about it. That's all they need to do initially, not just think, oh yeah, that's written down there, so it must be true. Just encourage them to start asking questions.
And the same with I know most of you, I think, probably are tertiary teachers, university teachers, but if you teach primary, you can do it with primary. Levels of language or levels of maturity. Obviously, you have to choose topics that match primary maturity, intellectual maturity. But apart from that, there's no reason why 8-year-olds can't start asking these questions. In fact, I say if you do it then, the life is much easier when you get to university, because the primary teacher has done the work.
Indeed.
It's midday in London. It's time we stop talking, Rachel. I think we can talk forever, as we
yes,
know.
we can go on. But thank you so much for joining us. And I think our audience really liked the webinar. They're saying thank you so much for our speakers. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rachel. That was very enlightening. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, as always.
And thank you, everyone, for your time and being here. I think we don't want to take any more of your time that we have been allotted. So we'll see you next time. Until then, thank you so much and take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.